When I saw my husband standing in the garage doorway, holding the small folded note I'd carelessly left wedged between a wrench and a pair of old gloves, my heart didn't just skip, it twisted violently in my chest. Not because he found out everything. No. But because I couldn't even explain what that note meant anymore. I had written it weeks ago, before things got real, when I still believed it was all just a game. Just a little spark to keep me feeling alive. His fingers clenched the paper tighter as his eyes scanned the words I had scribbled so stupidly, words meant for someone else. Words soaked in longing I didn't know I had. I wanted to scream, to grab the note and swallow it whole, erase the evidence of what had started in that garage, on those hot afternoons when I told myself it was harmless. But I didn't move. I just stood there, my palms cold, my breath stuck somewhere between shame and fury. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me. And I knew, this wasn't just about one note. This was about everything he hadn't wanted to see but now couldn't unsee. The silence between us cracked open a chasm. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about betrayal. This was about the pieces of me I'd been hiding for far too long. 3 months ago, I crossed a line I never thought I would. But before I take you there, before I tell you what really happened in that garage, why I did what I did, and what it cost me, tell me, have you ever done something that felt like nothing at first, but turned out to be everything? Leave your city in the comments. And answer this, have you ever held on to a secret so tightly it began to hurt? It started on a Thursday, one of those days that don't announce themselves as significant but quietly sit in the background, waiting to change everything. The kind of day that passes like any other, breakfast dishes in the sink, a to-do list taped to the fridge, and the low hum of a life that had long stopped surprising me. My husband was in the garage, as he often was, tinkering with the old tools his father left him. He liked to keep busy, fix things, polish metal that didn't need polishing. It gave him purpose. Or maybe just distraction. I respected it. But I didn't feel part of it. I watched him from the kitchen window for a while that morning. He was laughing with someone, the friend he'd known since high school, a man I barely paid attention to until lately. He'd always been around, the kind of person who blended into the background of barbecues and football games. But recently, I'd noticed him more. Noticed how he looked at me. Or maybe I imagined it. I'd been feeling invisible. Not unloved, just unseen. My husband cared for me in all the ways that didn't matter anymore, paying bills, filling up my car, setting the coffee the night before. It was a quiet, practical affection. But something in me had been restless for months. Restless in ways I didn't have the language for. I opened the fridge and closed it again. I wasn't hungry. I didn't know what I needed, but I knew I wouldn't find it in leftovers or half-empty jars. I grabbed a cloth, began wiping an already clean counter, the kind of task you do not because it's needed, but because your hands need something to do when your thoughts get too loud. Later, I heard the garage door close. The sound snapped me out of whatever fog I'd been in. I looked down at my hands and realized I was still holding the same rag, still moving it over the same clean spot on the counter. I laughed, but the sound didn't reach my chest. That evening, he came in with grease on his shirt and a tired smile. I asked him if he wanted dinner. He shrugged, said he wasn't too hungry. I nodded, neither was I. We sat in silence on opposite ends of the couch, the TV playing something neither of us watched. I thought about how many nights had passed like this. Hundreds, maybe. Thousands. And how we never asked each other the important questions anymore. Like, are you happy? Or, do you miss the way it used to be? The next morning, I walked past the garage on my way to the garden. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear laughter again. The same laugh, deep, rich, with a rhythm that made me pause. I didn't look inside. I just stood there for a moment, listening. Something in that sound made me feel curious. Curious in a way I hadn't felt since my 20s. It wasn't attraction, not then. It was the echo of something I used to be. Someone I used to be. Someone who was wanted. Later that week, I found myself baking. I used to bake all the time, back when the kids were little, when the house was full of noise and chaos and purpose. I hadn't baked in years. But suddenly I was elbow deep in flour and sugar, humming old songs, waiting for the oven to beep. When the cake was done, I didn't take it to the table. I didn't wrap it up for guests. I cut 2 slices, wrapped one, and walked it out to the garage. My husband wasn't there. But he was. He looked surprised when he saw me, wiping his hands on an old rag. "Your husband just left to get a part," he said. "He'll be back in a few." I nodded, held out the wrapped slice. "Baked too much," I said. "Thought you might want some." He smiled, that slow, deliberate kind of smile that doesn't say thank you but something more. He took the cake and set it aside. "You used to bake a lot," he said, and I blinked. "You remember?" "I notice more than people think I do," he said. That line stayed with me long after I walked back into the house. I repeated it in my head while folding laundry, while brushing my hair, while lying in bed beside a man who hadn't looked me in the eye in 3 days. He notices more than people think he does. I started noticing too, how often I checked the clock around the time I knew he'd be in the garage. How I found excuses to walk past it. How I lingered near the window, just out of sight. A week later, I cleaned the laundry room just so I'd have a reason to wash the rag he handed me that day. I held it in my hands longer than necessary, inhaling the scent of oil and sawdust, and something else I couldn't name. It was around this time I started keeping a journal again. Nothing poetic, just thoughts. Observations. Things I noticed. Things I felt but couldn't say out loud. One night, I wrote, "I want to be looked at like I matter. I don't need to be rescued. I need to be remembered." That entry was the first of many. It was also the one I later tore out and shoved in a pocket, meaning to burn it. But I didn't. And somehow, I still don't know how, it ended up in that garage. Folded between a wrench and a pair of old gloves. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because back then, everything still felt like a whisper. A possibility. A line I hadn't yet crossed. But the garage was already pulling me in. And part of me, a quiet, reckless part, didn't want to resist. The morning after the cake, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still, silent in that particular way it only was before sunrise, filled with the low hum of appliances and the whisper of wind against windows. My husband's steady breathing next to me felt like the metronome of a life I couldn't quite fall back into. I stared at the ceiling for a while, counting cracks in the paint, as if the patterns would spell out an answer. Downstairs, I moved through the kitchen in slow, deliberate motions. Coffee. Toast. Dishes I didn't need to wash again. Everything felt both ordinary and unbearable. There was no reason to feel this weight. Nothing had happened, not really. A slice of cake. A quiet moment. A single sentence that shouldn't have echoed so loudly. And yet it did. He had noticed something in me. Or maybe I had projected that onto him, hungry as I was to be seen. I told myself it was innocent, that I'd only brought him cake to be polite. But even I didn't believe that. Around noon, my husband called out that he'd be heading out for a few hours, hardware store, maybe lunch with a friend. I nodded, said I might do some gardening. As soon as the door shut behind him, I felt it, not freedom exactly, but a loosening. Like a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I stayed near the window for a while, pretending not to watch the garage. The door was open. I could hear the radio playing something soft and familiar. And then I saw him, the mechanic, standing near the workbench, wiping his hands, the same slow rhythm as always. He glanced toward the house once. Not long. Just enough. I moved on instinct. Picked up a glass of water I didn't need, grabbed a rag, anything to carry, to make it look like I had purpose. My hands trembled slightly as I stepped out the back door and crossed the distance to the garage. The air smelled of motor oil and late spring. Sharp, warm, alive. Inside, he looked up but said nothing. Just nodded, a quiet greeting. I placed the glass on a shelf, wiped imaginary dust from the edge of the table, and tried not to look directly at him. He asked if I'd like to see the project he'd been working on with my husband, an old motorcycle from the 80s, something they'd been trying to restore. I nodded. He walked over, started pointing things out, rust patterns, missing parts, how the engine refused to turn over. I didn't understand half of it, but I nodded when it felt right, asked questions to keep the moment going. I noticed how close we were standing. Not inappropriate, not obvious. But close enough that I could smell the faint trace of soap on his skin, something herbal and grounding. My fingers brushed his once as he handed me a tool, accidental, but electric. He didn't flinch. Neither did I. It should have ended there. It could have. But it didn't. We both reached for the same wrench, one of those clumsy, cinematic moments I never believed in. Our hands collided, stayed there, neither of us pulling away. My breath caught. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I didn't look away. We kissed. There were no words after. Just the sound of the radio, a low hum against the silence that followed. I stepped back. He didn't move. I turned and walked out, leaving the glass of water untouched. Back inside, I went straight to the bathroom and locked the door. My reflection in the mirror startled me. My face was flushed, my lips slightly parted. I looked different. Alive. Terrified. I splashed cold water on my face, dried it with a towel I didn't remember hanging there. My fingers trembled as I brushed my hair back. It was nothing, I told myself. A mistake. An impulse. But even as I tried to file it away under one of those categories, I knew I was lying. That night, I made dinner as usual. Chicken, roasted vegetables, the same salad we'd had twice already that week. My husband talked about replacing the gutters. I nodded, offered suggestions I didn't mean. Every time I looked at him, I felt the kiss replay behind my eyes. When we went to bed, he reached for me. His touch was habitual, not passionate. I allowed it. Lay still, let him move through motions we both knew by heart. There was no malice in it. No lack of care. Just absence. Like a routine we'd memorized but no longer believed in. Afterwards, he kissed my shoulder, murmured something I didn't catch, and turned over. I lay there, eyes open, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I wanted to feel guilt. I didn't. I wanted to feel shame. That didn't come either. What I felt was worse, the craving for something I couldn't name, and the fear that I'd already begun chasing it. The next morning, the mechanic wasn't in the garage. I watched all through breakfast. No music, no movement. Just silence. I told myself I was relieved. That maybe it was over before it began. That nothing more would happen. But the ache in my chest said otherwise. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of forced normalcy. I kept myself busy, or at least, I tried to convince myself I was. There was laundry to fold, groceries to restock, floors to sweep. I cleaned parts of the house I usually ignored, rearranged pantry shelves like the order of cans could fix something deeper. But beneath every mindless task, one truth sat heavy: I had crossed a line, and pretending otherwise didn't uncross it. The garage stayed quiet for nearly 3 days. I watched it from behind curtains like someone watching a door they weren't sure they wanted to open again. The usual soundtrack, the radio, the clang of metal, was gone. My husband was busy with work, gone longer hours than usual, and when he came home, he barely acknowledged the silence outside. Either he didn't notice or chose not to. I couldn't tell what was worse. On the 4th day, the sound returned. Late afternoon, when the light hit the side of the house just so, I heard it: music, low and steady, and the unmistakable shuffle of boots on the concrete floor. I stood frozen at the sink for a moment, dish towel clutched in my hands like a lifeline. I knew I shouldn't go out there. I told myself not to. But something inside me, a pull I didn't fully understand, wouldn't let me stay away. I walked out slowly, carrying a container of old cleaning rags I didn't actually plan to use. As I crossed the yard, my heart beat with a rhythm that felt too fast for such a short walk. He was bent over the workbench when I entered, focused on some small part he was turning in his hands. He looked up when he saw me, and something shifted in his expression, a softness, maybe. Or a question. I didn't speak. Neither did he. I set the rags on a nearby shelf and wiped my hands on my jeans, though they weren't dirty. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but charged, like static before a storm. He turned off the radio, and the quiet became total. Finally, he broke it. "You've been avoiding me." I didn't answer right away. What could I say? That I'd kissed him and then panicked? That I didn't know what I wanted, only that I needed something? I didn't know what to say, I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen." I looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't trying to seduce me. There was no game in his face, no arrogance. Just a man, waiting. It made me feel both seen and deeply exposed. "I don't want to make a mess," I said. He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "Sometimes the mess is already made." That was the end of it, for that moment. I left the garage soon after, but his words echoed for hours. The mess is already made. Was it? Or was I the one making it worse by going back again and again? That night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror longer than usual. I wore a loose shirt, old leggings, nothing special. But I studied my face, traced the lines that had deepened over the years, the shadows beneath my eyes, the way my mouth curved when I wasn't smiling. I wasn't young anymore, but I wasn't invisible either. And somehow, the way he looked at me confirmed that. The next afternoon, I was folding laundry when the doorbell rang. It was the mechanic. He held a small cardboard box with some parts my husband had ordered. I hadn't expected to see him at the door, and for a split second, my breath caught in my throat. "I was in the area," he said, handing me the box. "Figured I'd drop these off." I nodded, thanked him, made some comment about the weather. We stood awkwardly for a few seconds, until I motioned toward the kitchen. "Do you want some water?" He hesitated, then stepped inside. It was the first time he'd been in the house without my husband around. The space felt different with him in it, more alive, somehow. I poured 2 glasses, and we stood at the counter, drinking in silence. He glanced at the photographs on the wall, pictures of vacations, anniversaries, the kids. I wondered what he saw when he looked at them. A happy family? A woman pretending? "You used to smile more in those," he said, gesturing to the frames. "I used to have more to smile about," I replied, the words escaping before I could catch them. He didn't press. Just nodded and set down his glass. When he left, I stood at the door for a long time, staring out at the quiet street, the slow sway of tree branches in the wind. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't name. A cliff, maybe. Or a choice. The next few days passed without incident, but I was no longer pretending. I knew now what I was doing, walking a path I'd chosen, whether consciously or not. The guilt still hadn't come. What came instead was restlessness, a low hum in my chest that made it hard to sit still. I began dressing differently. Subtly. I didn't buy new clothes or put on makeup, but I chose things that made me feel more like myself, not the version of me that did chores and planned meals, but the one I used to be before routines replaced spontaneity. I wore earrings I hadn't touched in years. Painted my nails for no reason at all. One morning, I opened a drawer and found a scarf my mother had given me before she passed. Soft blue, almost translucent. I tied it around my neck and stared at my reflection. I didn't know who I was becoming, only that I wasn't ready to stop. That afternoon, I walked past the garage again. He was there, crouched beside the motorcycle, wiping oil from the frame. I didn't go in. I just watched. He didn't look up, but I knew he saw me. Later that night, I sat in bed while my husband snored lightly beside me. I picked up the notebook I kept in my nightstand, the one I used to write in during college. I hadn't opened it in years. But that night, I wrote. I think I want to be remembered. Not as the woman who made dinner or folded socks. As the woman who once burned quietly for something she didn't know how to name. I closed the book, placed it back in the drawer, and turned off the light. But sleep didn't come for a long time. My body stayed awake long after my mind tried to rest, listening for sounds from outside, a door closing, a car passing, the echo of footsteps in the driveway. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Only that I was. By the time the weekend arrived, I had managed to convince myself that everything was under control. I had told myself that it was just a slip, that people sometimes crave attention for reasons even they can't fully understand. I repeated phrases in my head like mantras, it didn't mean anything, nothing actually happened, I'm still loyal in all the ways that matter. But they didn't land with the reassurance I hoped for. They only reminded me that I was negotiating with my own conscience, trying to make a deal with discomfort. Saturday morning was unusually warm for the season. The sun was already high when I stepped outside with the intention of watering the plants, but I found myself walking toward the garage instead. I hadn't planned to. My feet just took me. The door was half open, and I heard the familiar clatter of tools being rearranged. That sound, once so ordinary, now carried a tension that seemed stitched into my skin. He was there, kneeling beside a box of spare parts, sorting through them with a slow precision. When he looked up and saw me, there was no surprise in his expression. Only recognition, like he'd expected me eventually. I stepped inside without speaking, pretending to glance around like I was checking on something. But he saw through it. We both knew I had no reason to be there. He stood up and wiped his hands on a rag, then leaned against the workbench. The moment hovered between us like a held breath. I opened my mouth to speak but found I had nothing prepared. There were no explanations, no apologies, only an impulse to remain in that space, to keep that thread from unraveling. I asked how the project was going, my voice casual to the point of being forced. He answered briefly, describing a part that had been ordered and was arriving next week. I nodded, even though the details didn't matter. What mattered was how close we were standing. Closer than polite conversation allowed. Not enough to touch, but enough to feel it. For a while, we fell into conversation, talking about small things. He asked if I liked working in the garden, and I answered with something vague. I commented on the weather, the early warmth, the birds that had started nesting in the corner of the garage roof. It was a performance, two people pretending they were safe within the boundaries of pleasantries. But the undercurrent was different now. Every sentence carried weight. Every silence said more than the words. Eventually, I said I should go. He didn't stop me, but something in his eyes, not disappointment, but understanding, made it harder to walk away than I'd expected. As I reached the door, he called my name. Just that. I turned, and for a second, neither of us said anything. "I'm not trying to mess up your life," he said. The words hit harder than I expected. They weren't accusatory. Just honest. "I know," I replied. I left without another word, but the silence trailed me like smoke. That afternoon, I couldn't focus on anything. I tried to read, flipped through pages without retaining a single sentence. I folded laundry and unfolded it again. I wandered from room to room, unable to settle. When my husband returned from his errands, he asked if I wanted to watch a movie that evening. I said yes. We sat side by side on the couch, watching a comedy we'd both seen before. I laughed in the right places. He reached for my hand once, and I let him. I even leaned my head on his shoulder halfway through. But inside, I felt disconnected, like I was performing affection, a version of myself rehearsing for an audience that no longer existed. That night, I dreamed of the garage. Not of him, not exactly. Just the space. The tools, the light, the hum of the radio. I woke up disoriented, tangled in sheets, my skin warm with a feeling I couldn't name. The next day, I avoided going outside. I cleaned the attic instead, something I'd been meaning to do for years. I pulled down boxes of old photos, school projects, souvenirs from vacations long past. I found a picture of myself taken 15 years ago on a beach. I was laughing, wearing sunglasses, holding a drink. My hair was messy, my skin tanned. I looked like someone who belonged in her own body. I sat with that image for a long time. Not longing for youth, but for that version of myself, the one who laughed without calculation, who didn't shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt that free. Later that afternoon, I took a walk around the block. I needed air, or at least movement. As I rounded the corner near the neighbor's driveway, I heard someone call out to me. It was Linda, the woman from across the street. Friendly, always chatty, always watching. She waved me over and asked if I'd seen the new car someone parked at the edge of the cul-de-sac. We chatted for a few minutes about neighborhood things, landscaping, garbage pickup, a rumor about someone moving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was studying me too closely, like she was waiting for me to reveal something. I kept the conversation short, polite, then excused myself with a comment about needing to start dinner. As I walked away, I felt her eyes on my back. It could have been nothing. Or it could have been everything. That's the thing about secrets, they make you paranoid, make you read meaning into every glance, every smile. That night, as I was setting the table, I found myself watching my husband again. Not suspiciously, not critically. Just watching. He moved around the kitchen with a kind of practiced ease. Comfortable in the silence between us. Maybe too comfortable. I wondered if he ever noticed the distance, or if he simply assumed that quiet was the same as contentment. When we sat down to eat, he asked if I'd heard from the mechanic lately. Just a passing comment, nothing heavy. I answered that I'd seen him in the garage earlier that week. He nodded and didn't push. Still, my pulse quickened. Was it a test? Or just conversation? After dinner, he went upstairs to take a shower. I stayed behind, cleaning slowly, taking longer than necessary. When I opened the kitchen window, I could hear faint music drifting from the direction of the garage again. That same song from the radio, the one I never used to notice. And that's when I knew, this wasn't a phase. This wasn't a single misstep to be forgotten. I had already started something, and no amount of pretending would undo it. The question now was whether I'd keep walking forward, or turn back before it was too late. But even as I asked myself that, the answer already hovered behind every breath I took. The next morning began like most others, with the soft sound of the kettle on the stove and the distant chirping of birds in the yard. I stood in the kitchen watching the water boil, trying not to let the weight in my chest settle in again, but it was becoming a familiar companion. Even the quiet of the house, once comforting, now felt accusatory, like every surface had memorized my silence and waited for me to confess to it. My husband was in the living room, going through emails on his tablet. He barely looked up when I placed a cup of coffee beside him. He mumbled a thank you, the same as always. I sat across from him at the table and watched the steam rise from my mug, wondering how many mornings we had shared like this, in parallel, not touching. After breakfast, he left to pick up supplies for a home repair project he had been putting off. Something about roof sealant and nails. I nodded along, offered to help later, even though we both knew I wouldn't. He kissed my temple as he passed by, a habitual gesture that felt like pressing a stamp onto something already sent. As the front door closed behind him, I stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen, waiting for the echo of his footsteps to disappear. Then I turned slowly and walked toward the back of the house, toward the door that led to the garage. My hand rested on the knob for a moment longer than necessary. I wasn't sure if I was hoping he would come back and stop me, or that he wouldn't. I pushed the door open and stepped into the sunlit yard. The day was warm again, thick with the smell of damp earth and fresh-cut grass. The garage door was open, and he was there, crouched beside a tire, tightening bolts with a ratchet. He looked up when he heard me, his expression unreadable, though something softened at the corners of his mouth. I crossed the distance between us slowly, deliberately. This time I didn't pretend I was coming to deliver anything or check on something. I didn't carry a plate or a story. I simply walked into his space like I had every right to be there. He stood up as I approached, wiping his hands on a cloth. For a moment, we just looked at each other. No greetings. No excuses. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure I would," I answered. The silence that followed was heavier than words. We both knew that whatever had begun weeks ago had moved past the stage of uncertainty. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This wasn't a question. It was a direction. A choice, even if we still didn't know where it would lead. He moved aside and gestured toward the bike. "Want to help?" It was a simple offer, one that carried more weight than it should have. I nodded and stepped closer. He handed me a wrench and explained what needed to be done. His voice was calm, patient. I followed his instructions, working slowly, aware of how close we were standing, how often our hands brushed. We didn't talk much. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was thick with tension, but not the kind that begged to be broken. More like the kind that made you lean in. Every small movement felt amplified. The way I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The way he adjusted the position of my hand on the wrench. The way I noticed his fingers lingered just a second too long. At some point, the music on the radio shifted to an older song, something mellow and full of memory. We both paused. It was one of those songs that belongs to no one and everyone. It filled the garage like a sigh. I stood up straight, stretching my back. He offered me a rag to wipe the grease from my fingers, and when I reached for it, our hands touched again. We didn't pull away this time. We kissed. It was different from the first time. Slower. More certain. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt. Just contact, direct, undeniable, and real. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. I just allowed it. And for that moment, I felt fully present. Not as a wife, not as someone sneaking around, but as a woman who still had the capacity to be moved. We parted with a shared breath. I stepped back, blinked at the sudden rush of daylight, and folded the rag in my hands like it meant something. Neither of us said anything right away. There was nothing to explain. It had already been explained in gestures, in glances, in the way my hand had trembled when it touched his, and how he hadn't let go. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, he called out. "You don't have to disappear." "I know," I said without looking back. When I entered the house again, I moved through the hallway slowly, half expecting to find my husband standing there. But the house was still empty. Safe. Or pretending to be. I went to the bathroom and washed my hands longer than necessary, watching the grease swirl away in the sink. I'd changed clothes, tucked the stained rag into the laundry, and stood in front of the mirror. I didn't look guilty. I looked different. There was color in my face, a light in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. And yet, beneath that, I could feel the weight pressing against my chest again. The one that whispered, "This can't last." When my husband returned home in the late afternoon, he brought lunch. Sandwiches from the deli I liked. We ate in the backyard, sitting at the patio table under the shade of the big oak. He talked about shingles and wood rot, about the neighbors renovating their bathroom. I nodded, responded where I could, but my mind was elsewhere. He looked at me at one point and said, "You seem different lately. Is everything okay?" I smiled. "Not too much. Just enough to keep the mask in place." "I think I'm just tired," I said. He accepted the answer without pressing. That was his way, to take what I gave him and not ask for more. Once, I had appreciated that. Now, I wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, listening to the ceiling fan clicking with every rotation, thinking about lines and the people who cross them. I thought about choices, the ones we justify, the ones we pretend weren't choices at all. I thought about the garage. About him. About how easy it had been to go back. I thought about the kiss. How it wasn't thrilling. It wasn't reckless. It was something else entirely. Something I hadn't felt in years of recognition. Of myself. Of what I had buried. And I thought about tomorrow. Because no matter how carefully I stepped, tomorrow would still be waiting. With its silence. With its possibility. With its cost. Sunday arrived with a breeze strong enough to stir the curtains and rattle the edge of the screen door. The morning sunlight spread lazily across the floorboards, and I lay in bed longer than usual, eyes open but unfocused. I heard the faint clinking of dishes downstairs, the unmistakable sound of my husband putting away the mugs I usually left out overnight. It was one of those rituals we no longer talked about. He cleaned up after me without complaint, and I let him without thanks. That had become our rhythm. I pulled the covers back and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the air wash over my bare legs. I didn't want to move, didn't want to see him, didn't want to pretend again. But I also didn't want to be alone with the echo in my own mind. It felt like no matter what I did, I would be choosing between two versions of dishonesty. Downstairs, he greeted me with a smile and poured me coffee without asking. I murmured something close to a thank you and took a sip. It burned a little. I didn't mind. He said something about driving out to his brother's place. They were working on a deck, or maybe replacing fencing. I nodded along, giving the necessary affirmations. At one point, he looked up from his toast and studied me. "You sure you're okay lately?" That question again. It had become his way of saying, I know something's wrong, but I'm hoping you'll save me the burden of asking. I smiled softly. Just tired. I think I'm coming down with something. That seemed to satisfy him. He got up, kissed the top of my head, and left shortly after with a list of errands and a set of spare gloves. When the door clicked shut, the quiet was immediate and complete. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, still holding my mug, and waited for something, a sign, a thought, a reason not to do what I already knew I was going to do. Nothing came. I walked to the back door and stepped outside. The garage looked the same as it always did, worn, slightly cluttered, humming with the presence of something unspoken. The door was half closed, but I saw the shadow of movement inside. He was there. I didn't hesitate this time. I crossed the yard, pushed open the door fully, and stepped inside. He didn't look surprised. He was sitting on a stool, elbows resting on his knees, wiping his hands with a rag already stained from the morning's work. He looked at me like he'd been waiting. I said nothing at first. Just stood there, unsure whether to sit, move, speak. Finally, I leaned against the wall near the window and let the silence thicken. The air smelled like metal and oil and sawdust. It always did. But now it felt like part of the ritual, like an atmosphere that belonged only to this space, to us, in it. He nodded toward a second stool. You want to sit? I did. He handed me a bottle of water, and I took it even though I wasn't thirsty. I held it between my palms, tracing the condensation with my fingers, unsure of how to begin. He broke the quiet. You didn't have to come. I know, I said. He looked down at the rag in his hands and folded it slowly, like it mattered. It's getting harder to pretend, isn't it? That sentence struck deeper than I expected. It wasn't a question, more like a diagnosis. I nodded, barely. I think about it, I said, finally. About what I'm doing. About what it means. He waited, like he didn't want to interrupt. But it doesn't stop me, I continued. And that scares me more than anything. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of shared understanding had become something we could sit inside without explanation. I stood, walked toward the open window, and stared out into the backyard. The garden looked dry. The hose was curled uselessly at the edge of the lawn. I realized I hadn't watered anything in days. I used to love this time of year, I said quietly. Everything growing. Everything changing. He stepped beside me, not close, not far, just enough that I felt his presence. Maybe you still do. Just differently now. We stood there a while, saying nothing. I didn't want to fill the air with conversation for the sake of it. I wanted to let the moment settle, to feel what it felt like without covering it up. After a while, I turned to leave. He didn't stop me. But as I reached the door, he said something that stayed with me long after I'd gone. I see you, he said. Even when you don't want to be seen. I walked back to the house slowly. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the back door behind me. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was something closer to exposure, like someone had turned on a light in a room I'd kept dark for years. I spent the rest of the day in a kind of limbo. I cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. Reorganized drawers that had been untouched for months. I avoided mirrors. I avoided windows. I tried not to listen for footsteps outside, but I did anyway. When my husband returned late that afternoon, his face was red from the sun. He smiled and kissed me again, and I let him. He told me about the progress on the deck and how his brother's dog had gotten into the paint. I laughed at the right parts. He didn't notice that the sound didn't reach my eyes. After dinner, he asked if I wanted to take a walk. I agreed. We walked around the block, past familiar houses with their perfect hedges and trimmed lawns. Everything looked normal, which made the chaos inside me feel even louder. At one point, he reached for my hand, and I let him take it. I tried to focus on the feeling, the comfort, the warmth, the familiarity, but it was distant, like touching something through a sheet of glass. Back home, he went to shower, and I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing dishes that were already clean. I looked out the window toward the garage. The door was closed now. The light was off. But it didn't matter. I could still feel it pulling at me. Not the place, but what it had become. I dried my hands and went upstairs. In the quiet of our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my journal. I hadn't written in days. My thoughts had become too loud to capture. But now, I wrote a single sentence. I am losing track of who I am, but for the first time, I'm not sure I want to go back. I closed the journal, turned off the lamp, and lay down beside my husband. His breathing slowed as he drifted to sleep. I stared at the ceiling and listened, not to him, but to the sound of myself, still wide awake. It was a Wednesday when everything shifted again. The kind of day that starts like any other, quiet and unassuming, without warning of what it will become. I remember the way the sun looked filtered through the blinds, slanted and sharp, like lines drawn on the kitchen floor. I had barely finished my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed against the countertop with a short message, leaving town for a delivery this afternoon. Driving north. Want to come? There was no name, no elaboration, but I didn't need either. I stared at the message for a long time, not answering. Not yet. My heart beat faster than it should have for something so small, just a few words, simple and informal. But it was the invitation beneath them that made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than any kiss. I spent most of the morning doing nothing and everything at once. I folded laundry, repotted a plant, rearranged the spice rack, all the while rehearsing ways to say no. But I didn't say no. I didn't say anything. I just let the possibility hover above me like fog. At lunch, my husband told me he had a meeting across town and probably wouldn't be home until late. He listed errands he'd try to run on the way back, hardware store, maybe stopping by his cousin's place. I nodded, gave all the right responses. I asked if he needed me to pick up anything. He smiled and said no. He kissed my cheek before leaving, and I watched from the window as his car pulled out of the driveway and turned the corner. I stood there long after the car was gone. My reflection in the glass was ghost-like, washed out by the midday light. I looked at myself and asked the same question I'd been asking for weeks, "What are you doing?" But this time, the question didn't stop me. I texted back, "What time?" The reply came quickly. "Leaving in 30. I changed clothes slowly, deliberately, choosing something that made me feel like myself, not the version I'd performed for years, but the version that had begun to emerge quietly, privately, in the margins of my life. I tied my hair back, grabbed a jacket, and stepped outside. He was waiting in his truck when I reached the driveway. The engine was running, the windows down. He didn't look surprised to see me. Just nodded once, a gesture that said more than anything else. I climbed in. We drove in silence at first. The road stretched ahead of us, long and familiar, framed by dry fields and old barns leaning with age. He turned the radio down low, some station playing a mix of songs from decades ago. It felt like background music to a scene I hadn't meant to write myself into. Neither of us spoke for miles. It wasn't uncomfortable, just suspended. I watched the landscape roll past, the blur of fence posts and telephone wires, the sky opening up wider the farther we got from town. Eventually, he spoke. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I kept my eyes on the road ahead. "I wasn't sure either." That was all we said for a while. There was no need for explanation. No one was pretending anymore. We stopped for gas outside a small town I didn't recognize. While he filled the tank, I wandered toward the convenience store, bought a bottle of water and a small pack of mints I didn't need. When I came back out, he was leaning against the truck, arms crossed, watching the clouds gather in the distance. "Storm's coming," he said. I looked up. The sky was darker now, heavy with the kind of weight that doesn't always break into rain but threatens to. The wind had picked up slightly, just enough to make my jacket feel too thin. We got back in and continued driving. He told me about the delivery, some old engine part going to a collector 2 towns over. Nothing exciting, just something he'd agreed to do weeks ago. He hadn't expected to bring company. "I'm glad you did," he added, not looking at me. I didn't reply. But I didn't regret coming. We reached the drop-off point, a quiet property down a gravel road lined with bare trees. He handled the exchange quickly, professionally. I stayed in the truck, listening to the distant sound of wind moving through branches, the occasional creak of wood, the sharp slam of a shed door. When he returned, he slid into the driver's seat without a word, and we turned back toward the highway. It was on the way home that the silence changed. Not heavier, just different. More aware. More present. The road was narrower now, winding between hills and patches of pine. He pulled off onto a small side road, one I didn't recognize, and parked near an old overlook. There wasn't much of a view, just open land, a field gone wild with weeds, and the long stretch of sky above it. We sat there for a moment, neither of us moving. He turned the ignition off. The sudden absence of engine noise made everything feel louder, the wind, the ticking of the dashboard, the sound of my own breath. Then, quietly, simply, he said, "We don't have to go further than this. Just sit. Just be here." I nodded. And so we sat, 2 people who had long since run out of reasons to pretend they weren't crossing a line. We spent the night together. We didn't speak much on the drive back. The silence was full, but not uncomfortable. There was nothing left to explain. We both knew what had happened. More importantly, we both knew it hadn't started today. Today had only made it undeniable. When he dropped me off, he didn't kiss me. Didn't reach for my hand. Just looked at me for a long moment and said, "Take care of yourself." I watched his truck pull away before stepping back into the house. The lights were still off. Everything was where I had left it. Nothing had changed, except everything. I took off my jacket, hung it in the hallway, and stood in the kitchen, unsure what to do with my hands. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, measuring the time between choices I couldn't undo. I didn't feel guilt. Not then. I felt something closer to stillness. As if, after weeks of circling the same thought, I had finally stepped inside it. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, who returned late and fell asleep almost immediately. I stared at the ceiling again, the same fan turning overhead, the same shadows cast across the room. But I didn't feel like the same woman. Because now, I couldn't go back. Even if I wanted to. Even if I tried. The following morning came with a dull gray sky, overcast and heavy, as if even the weather carried the weight of what I now knew I couldn't take back. I awoke before the alarm, lying still in the soft silence of the bedroom, staring at the ceiling that had witnessed so many nights of quiet routine. My husband's breathing was slow and even beside me, his back turned toward mine. I could feel the warmth of his body but not its presence. We had shared this bed for decades, but last night, more than ever, it felt like we had slept in different worlds. I moved quietly through the motions of the morning. Brushed my teeth. Pulled on jeans. Folded a sweater over my arm that I didn't need but carried anyway, just to keep my hands busy. I lingered by the mirror in the hallway longer than usual. There was something different about my face. Not guilt, not visibly, at least, but something more muted. A quietness in my eyes I hadn't seen before. As if the version of myself I had been clinging to was already beginning to dissolve. Downstairs, I made coffee without sound, careful not to clang the cups or let the drawer slam shut. I stared out the window above the sink while it brewed, watching the neighbor's cat curl up under the birdbath. The world, it seemed, was entirely indifferent to the tectonic shift that had occurred inside me. My husband eventually came down, hair still damp from his shower, his expression neutral as he greeted me. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sipped it slowly, flipping through the newspaper. His routine, unlike mine, remained untouched. He didn't look up as he asked if I had plans for the day. I said no. I lied. I left the house an hour later, claiming I needed to go to the store, maybe run a few errands. He nodded, already halfway through a crossword puzzle, as if nothing I could say would ever be unexpected. Maybe it wouldn't. I drove aimlessly at first, not toward the store, not toward him, just forward. The road passed in stretches of trees and intersections I didn't recognize. I passed a park where children ran along the edge of a pond, and I thought for a moment how far I had drifted from that version of life, the one filled with strollers and carpools and birthday candles. I didn't miss it. But I missed the certainty it once gave me. Eventually, I turned toward the industrial part of town, past warehouses and repair shops, the air filled with the sharp tang of oil and rust. I didn't plan to go to the garage, but somehow my hands steered the wheel as if they already knew where I needed to be. When I arrived, the place was closed. The large door was drawn shut, and the smaller side door was locked. No sound. No movement. I sat in my car for a while, staring at the building, wondering if this was a sign, if the universe was giving me a brief opportunity to reconsider. I didn't text him. I didn't call. I simply turned the key again and drove home. Back inside the house, everything felt louder. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the creak of floorboards beneath my feet. I went to the laundry room and pulled out a basket of towels to fold. My hands worked automatically, smooth and practiced, but my thoughts were nowhere near the linens. I wondered what I had done. Not just the act itself, but the deeper betrayal, the way I had stepped outside of myself, created a new version of who I was, and didn't hate her. That was the most dangerous part. That I felt more alive in one afternoon with him than I had in years of married mornings. Around noon, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote in my journal again. The words came slowly, but they came. I don't feel ashamed. That's what frightens me. I feel awakened. And now I don't know how to live with what I've awakened. The letters stared back at me in crooked lines. I closed the journal quickly and tucked it back into the drawer. It felt like a live wire I wasn't ready to touch again. Later that evening, my husband suggested we go for a walk. I agreed. The sky had cleared slightly, the wind cool against our skin as we moved along the quiet neighborhood paths. We passed houses we knew well, smiled politely at neighbors, made light conversation about the upcoming change in seasons. It was as if the evening was determined to be ordinary. But something shifted when we passed the old oak tree near the edge of the neighborhood, the one with the bench beneath it, the one we used to stop at when the kids were little. He paused, sat down, and patted the spot beside him. I hesitated before sitting. We were quiet for a while, the branches swaying gently overhead, the sound of wind moving through the leaves like whispered words neither of us could hear clearly. He looked out over the grass, not at me. You've been distant lately. The words settled between us like stones. Heavy. Plain. I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't ready to lie, but I wasn't ready to tell the truth either. So I said the only thing I could. I know. He nodded slowly. Is it me? Or is it something else? I don't know, I said. And in that moment, it wasn't a lie. He didn't push. That had always been his nature, quiet patience that bordered on detachment. He reached for my hand, held it loosely. His touch was warm, familiar, but no longer grounding. It felt like a rope I was supposed to hold on to, even if I no longer believed it could pull me back to shore. We walked home without speaking. The sun was low by then, casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside, he turned on the news. I made tea. We moved around each other like ghosts who remembered being alive but no longer knew how to act like it. Before bed, he kissed my forehead and said, "Whatever it is, I hope you find peace with it." I stood in the dark hallway after he went upstairs, the light from the living room casting a faint glow on the floor. His words echoed. Not we, not us. Just you. Alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay with my eyes open, staring into the darkness, replaying everything. The truck. The field. The silence. The version of me that had stepped out of her own life and breathed in a different kind of air. I realized then that the real consequence of what I had done wasn't the risk of being caught. It was the realization that I could no longer be satisfied by pretending. That the door I had opened didn't lead back. And I wasn't sure if I wanted it to. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a white envelope, plain and unmarked, wedged awkwardly between the pages of the neighborhood newsletter that arrived every few weeks. I almost didn't see it. It slipped out onto the floor as I was tossing the rest of the mail onto the counter, coupons, flyers, reminders of the local farmers market. The envelope stood out by how little it offered, no name, no return address, no handwriting. I stared at it for a moment, frozen, as if it had a pulse. My first thought wasn't confusion. It was fear. With fingers that felt too slow, I picked it up and turned it over. The seal was weak, as if it had been closed in a hurry or reopened more than once. I opened it carefully, my breath caught in my chest, and pulled out the contents. It was a photograph. One single photograph. In it, I was standing at the side of the garage, my hand outstretched, reaching for his. The moment caught between gestures, not an embrace, not overt, but unmistakably intimate. The angle was distant, but the implication was clear. My stomach twisted in a way I hadn't expected. Not because of what the image showed, but because someone had been watching. The letter contained nothing else. No threat. No note. Just the photograph. I stood motionless in the kitchen for several minutes, the paper trembling slightly in my grip. The silence around me deepened, as if the walls were holding their breath. Someone knew. The reality of that settled over me like a dense fog. I tried to think. Who would do this? A neighbor? Someone who had seen something by accident? Was it random? Or was it deliberate? My mind immediately flashed to Linda, the neighbor across the street who always seemed to know more than she should, always looking from her porch with that curious tilt of her head, always offering pleasantries that felt laced with subtext. I tucked the envelope back inside the newsletter and slid the entire bundle into the back of the pantry, behind an old cake pan I hadn't used in years. Out of sight. For now. The rest of the day moved slowly, each hour weighed down by questions I couldn't answer. I checked the mailbox again that afternoon, as if expecting more. Nothing. I walked around the side of the house and scanned the rooftops, the fences, the windows across the street. Everything looked exactly as it always did, which made the uncertainty worse. When my husband returned that evening, I couldn't look at him the same way. Not because I felt guilt that had dulled into something less specific, but because now there was danger. Real danger. Someone else had stepped into the story I was still trying to write for myself. We ate dinner in silence. I answered his questions automatically. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual. But every time he looked away, I found myself studying him, searching for signs. Had he seen it? Was this a test? That night, while he slept, I retrieved the envelope and sat on the bathroom floor under the weak light above the mirror. I stared at the photo again, this time with sharper eyes. The angle suggested distance, maybe from a window across the yard, or a second story. Whoever had taken it had done so with intent. It wasn't accidental. Someone had waited for the moment. But why? The next day, I walked past the garage and felt it differently. The weight of what had once been our secret had shifted. It no longer belonged just to us. There was someone else in the room now, silent, invisible, and possibly waiting. I didn't go inside. Instead, I drove across town, needing distance, space to think. I parked outside a coffee shop I used to frequent years ago, a place where I had once spent long afternoons with a book or my thoughts. I ordered tea and sat in the corner by the window, watching the people pass. For a while, I tried to imagine that none of it had happened. That I was simply a woman with a quiet life, sitting in a quiet cafe, untouched by complication. But the lie didn't hold. I couldn't stop glancing at my phone, half expecting another message, another warning, another photo. But nothing came. That evening, I returned home just as the sun was dipping below the rooftops. My husband was already in the backyard, watering the garden. He smiled when he saw me, and I smiled back, but my heart was still racing. I kept waiting for a confrontation, a question, anything. But it never came. Maybe he didn't know. Not yet. After dinner, I sat alone in the living room while he showered. The TV was on, but I wasn't watching. I kept seeing that photo. That exact moment frozen in time. It was more than exposure. It was a rupture. Because if someone else knew, how much longer until everyone did? And what would happen then? Would he leave? Would I? I thought about the man in the garage, about the quiet steadiness of him, about how I had stepped into something real and irreversible. I hadn't seen him since that afternoon in the field. No texts. No visits. But now, more than ever, I needed to know if he had received something too. I texted him a single question, "Did you get anything?" No response. I waited for an hour, then two. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling again, the same shadows stretching across the room. The same fan rotating softly above. But everything beneath it had changed. I wasn't afraid of what I had done. I was afraid of who now had control of the story. Because secrets are only safe when they're yours alone. And mine wasn't anymore. It was a strange kind of quiet that morning, the kind that didn't just sit in the room, but pressed against your skin. Everything felt slowed down, muted, as if the air itself had thickened. My husband had left early for an appointment in town, and for the first time in days, the house was truly, completely mine. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the street. The trash bins were out. The neighbor's dog barked at the mail truck. Somewhere nearby, a lawn mower started up, its distant drone vibrating through the stillness. Normalcy, playing like a background track, indifferent to whatever was unraveling beneath the surface. I hadn't heard back from him. Not a single word since my message the night before. And the silence wasn't just empty, it was pointed. It told me something had changed, and not in a way I could fix. The photograph stayed hidden in the pantry, untouched since I'd buried it there. But its presence weighed heavier every hour. Not just the image, but what it represented, a truth no longer just mine. The tension had become part of the furniture, part of the air. I found myself flinching at the sound of the doorbell, checking over my shoulder when walking through the neighborhood, scanning faces for signs of knowledge. I thought about calling him. Just once. Just to hear his voice. But the thought died quickly. Whatever existed between us now wasn't something that could be smoothed over by a phone call. By noon, I gave up trying to focus on anything. I turned off the laundry machine mid-cycle, left the kitchen half-cleaned, and sat in the living room staring at a book I wasn't reading. The words blurred. My thoughts spun in circles, looping around questions with no answers. Then the knock came. It was soft. Almost hesitant. I froze. For a moment, I didn't move. I just sat there, the book still open in my lap, heartbeat echoing in my ears. The second knock was firmer. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my shirt with damp palms as I walked toward the front door. I opened it. It was Linda. She stood on the porch, arms crossed lightly over her chest, holding a small plate of cookies covered with plastic wrap. Her smile was polite. Too polite. I baked too many, she said. I nodded slowly and stepped aside. Thank you. She didn't move to enter, just handed me the plate and stayed where she was, her eyes not leaving my face. I hope you're doing all right, she added. You've seemed a little distracted lately. I said I was fine. That I'd just been busy. That the weather change always made me feel a bit off. She smiled again. Of course. I just thought I'd check in. We stood in silence for a moment longer, the cookies between us like a strange offering. Then she turned and walked back down the steps, pausing briefly at the sidewalk. Take care, she said without turning around. When she disappeared around the corner, I stood in the doorway for several minutes, cookies in hand, wondering if I was imagining things. Wondering if the envelope had come from her. Wondering if the entire street had already seen what I thought was still hidden. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He looked tired, but not in a way that worried me, just the weariness of someone who'd had too many errands and not enough rest. He mentioned something about picking up a part for the lawnmower, then kissed my cheek and went upstairs to change. I stood at the kitchen counter, slicing vegetables for dinner, my hands moving by habit while my mind raced. I felt like I was living on a delay, a beat behind everything, performing the motions of a life that had already slipped out from under me. Halfway through chopping an onion, he walked back into the room. There's something we should talk about, he said. I looked up. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I nodded once, slowly. Okay. He paused before speaking again. Someone dropped something off at the shop today. A copy of a photo. Said I should see it. I said nothing. My breath caught. It wasn't labeled. No explanation. Just the picture. I stared at him, waiting for the next blow. He exhaled. I guess I just want to hear it from you. The silence that followed stretched impossibly wide. I placed the knife down gently on the cutting board and turned toward him, hands still trembling. I don't know how to start, I said. He nodded. Then start wherever you can. So I did. I told him the truth, not all of it, not every detail, but enough. Enough to confirm what he already knew. Enough to stop hiding. Enough to hurt. He didn't shout. He didn't walk away. He just listened. When I finished, we stood in that kitchen like strangers, surrounded by the smell of onions and the clatter of a life coming apart in slow motion. He ran a hand down his face, then looked up at me. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. Why? The word landed heavier than the rest. I searched for something honest. Because I forgot who I was. And when I remembered, I was afraid I couldn't be her again, not here. Not with you. He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. A kind of resigned sadness passed through his eyes. I don't know what this means for us, he said. Neither do I. That night, he didn't sleep in our bed. He took a pillow and a blanket to the guest room without a word. I lay alone, staring at the ceiling fan once again, the shadows moving slowly across the wall. For the first time since everything began, I cried. Not because I'd been caught. Not because I was ashamed. But because I finally understood the cost of not knowing what you really need until it's already too late. The next morning, we didn't talk much. He made coffee, I folded the laundry. We moved around each other gently, like people tiptoeing through broken glass. When he left for work, I stood by the window, holding the still warm mug in both hands. Across the street, Linda sat on her porch, sipping from her own cup. She waved. I didn't wave back.